Hello. My name is Eric Majors, and the discussion that I have for you today involves the Islam faith, the faith of Muslims around the world. The religion of Islam today has a problem. It has an identity crisis. Because there's the Islam of today, and there's the Islam that was preached by the Prophet Muhammad. The literal definition of the word Muslim in Arabic means one who submits to the will of God. And so anyone who worships God could call themselves a Muslim, technically, a Christian. I'm a Christian. I could call myself a Muslim because I submit to the will of God. In addition, the faith of Islam believes in the Old Testament of the Bible. And it says specifically in the Quran that believers in the Old Testament of the Bible, to include Jews, Muslims, all of us would be Muslims, and Christians, the believers in Christ, are all Muslims. They're all people who submit to the will of God. That is what is written in the Quran. It says that believers include people who read the Old Testament and Christians, so Judaism and Christianity. So the identity crisis that is happening in the faith of Islam today is that there is the Islam that is talked about in the Quran and that was practiced by the Prophet Muhammad, and then there is the Islam that is being practiced today, which is very different than that which was practiced by the Prophet Muhammad. And I can say that because for the first 600 years after the death and during the later years of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, Christians, Jewish people, and Muslims all prayed and worshiped together. There was peace. Peace flourished. At some point in time or another, a conflict arose between the Christians and the Muslims. But that was hundreds of years later. The problem that we have today is that the people who practice the Muslim faith today, many of them, regard the word infidel as anybody who attacks someone who is a Muslim. And there's a problem with that. There's a problem today with the definition of what is an infidel. In the day of the Prophet Muhammad, there were people who attacked the Prophet and his followers because of their religious beliefs. And those people would be considered infidels. But today, anybody who insults or attacks or makes fun of anyone who is Muslim for any reason, whether the person is a practicing Muslim or they just happen to be Muslim, then they are considered an infidel, whether it is an attack on their faith or it is not an attack on their faith. And so we have a crisis. We have a crisis because nations like the United States engage in war around the world for a variety of reasons. Some economic reasons, some to protect their own interests. And sometimes these reasons include or claim to include that we go to war based to protect moral values, to protect lives of people who are being lost, or some moral ground. Now that has created a problem for the United States, but that's another story, because the United States also has an identity crisis in that we've lost credibility in the world because of our engagement into some of these battles when we claim that we're going in on moral grounds, but in fact we are going in for business grounds. But that's another subject. But nonetheless, waging war against people who happen to be Muslim is not the same thing as attacking the Muslim faith. And so in the United States we have a concept known as freedom of religion, and so I think that there's a misunderstanding when it comes to the fact that when we wage war, whether it be for oil or whether it be for some supposed moral reason, that we are not doing it as an attack against Muslims. We are just doing it for whatever the stated reasons are. It really has nothing to do with their religion. And in fact, most of the people in the United States, I believe, are not well versed on what the beliefs of Muslims and Islam are. So that's the first issue, is that we have a crisis in the faith of Islam in the sense that there is a misunderstanding about this word, what is an infidel. Another problem that we have with the difference between the modern Islam and Islam of the day of the Prophet Muhammad is that the Prophet Muhammad specifically, well, in the Quran it specifically states that Christ is the Messiah. And when we use the word Messiah, it's not the same thing as a prophet, okay, who comes to speak a word. A Messiah is the word. Or let me not even assign any definitions to the word Messiah, other than to say that someone who is a Messiah we would consider to be of someone that we should listen to or have a great deal of understanding about. If that's what our religion would say to us, that someone is a Messiah, it would stand to reason that we would pay attention to whatever that Messiah had to say. Well, in the faith of Islam, there's an argument that says that, the faith of Islam today, that is, there is an argument that says that because there are so many versions of the New Testament of the Bible and the Old Testament of the Bible, that these books of faith are unreliable. Even though the Quran specifically states that those who are believers in these books are brothers and sisters, and they are also Muslims, the modern day Islam says, no, that's not true, because you have different versions of the Bible, and we can't rely on any of these things as having been the words of Christ. Notwithstanding the fact that one of the great pillars of the faith of Islam is that the Quran was written in Arabic, and it has not been changed throughout the course of time. It has been preserved very carefully, the actual text. But when you translate it, I've read several, I don't read Arabic, I've read several English versions of the Quran, and they say slightly different things. So therefore, even though the Quran, the text of it may change, it is still subject to the interpretation of many different people, as evidenced by the Sunnis and the Shia and all these different organizations. The problem with the Islam of today is the same problem as with many religions, including the Christian religion, religion of Judaism, is that the words of the original authors tend to become polluted with the interests of mankind. We call that religion. Religion isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be a very valuable tool. But it can also become a stumbling block, because religion is really the doctrine of people. And so, over a period of time, religions such as Islam and certain sects of Christianity and various other religions can become polluted. There are many, many writings about the Prophet Muhammad and his life, and many of modern day people of Islam consider it their obligation to live in accordance with the exact same practices and customs of the Prophet Muhammad in the time and date when he was alive. And that creates a lot of obvious problems, because number one, the Quran does not say to do that. This is just a man-made invention. It's an idea that this should be done. So again, we're back to a problem with the identity crisis in Islam. There's the Islam of the past, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims prayed in the same temples. They all got along with each other, and there was 600 years of peace. And then there's the Islam of today, which appears to appeal and attract individuals who want to focus in on claiming that everyone who is against them is an infidel. That creates another problem. Because if everyone who disagrees with you is an infidel, then you propped yourself up as your own God. And that means that anyone who disagrees with you is your enemy, who is deserving of being slain or attacked. So there is the presumption of many people who are practicing modern Islam that their beliefs are the will of God. And so they go out and kill people, thinking that they are performing the will of God, when in fact they are actually not taking responsibility for their own disagreements with other people. I strongly encourage those of the Muslim faith to read the Christian Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And particularly, not for the specificity of the words that are stated in there, but to gain an understanding of what it is that Christ stood for. Because I do believe that when the Prophet Muhammad wrote in the Quran, when the Quran was written, that Christians and Christ was the Messiah and that Christians are our brothers, there's a reason for that. Christ's doctrine is a doctrine of forgiveness. Christ's doctrine recognizes the fact that human beings are by design fallible, that the perfect human experience of life includes people making mistakes and having wrong ideas and taking wrong action. And if we are to evolve as a species, we have to have a system that enables people to learn from their mistakes. And so when someone commits a sin in Christianity, the entire message of Christ is essentially that if they recognize that sin, that they should be forgiven and be able to move on from there and try again to be a better person. Whereas the modern day faith of Islam tends to focus more on the punishment of the person who has committed some infraction or a sin. The most extreme form of modern Islam today would say to cut off the head of someone who has made a mistake, which really doesn't provide any opportunity for someone to evolve to a next level. If you cut off someone's head when they make a mistake, how are they ever going to progress and learn from their mistakes? And so how are we as a culture, as a human race, ever going to be able to achieve higher levels of consciousness that we're all evolving into? So the modern day faith of Islam is ignoring the message of Christ, even though the Quran specifically states that Christ is the Messiah. It's not as important as what the actual specific words of the Bible say, as much as it's important as the idea that Christ was trying to impart as a Messiah. And whether or not, as Muslims believe, or the Quran states that Christ did not actually die on the cross, but was made to appear as though he died. Again, there are many interpretations of that too. Does anyone really die when their physical body dies? But not getting into that debate. If you are a Muslim and you assume that the Quran is correct and that Jesus didn't physically die but was only made to appear as though he died, it does not diminish the relevance of the message of Christ, because Christ on the cross said very simply, "Forgive those people who are persecuting me, for they know not what they do." So this is one of the most profound, if not the only message, really, the biggest one, that can be taken from the life of Christ, that should be integrated into the modern day Islam in the way that it was integrated into the Islam of the Prophet Muhammad during his time and the 600 years of peace that occurred after that. The Prophet Muhammad and his tribe didn't go and lob off people's heads that were Christian and Jews, because it specifically states in the Quran that we are all brothers and believers. We all subject ourselves to the will of God. And so what is happening today is abhorrent. It also states in the Quran specific punishments, if you will, for women, but it speaks a great deal about their rights. I've read nowhere in the Quran where anyone is given a right for any reason to enslave women or to demean them or to force them into prostitution. Those things are not supported in the text of the Quran. They're simply not supported. So there again you have this crisis in the faith of Islam today. Another component, an unfortunate side effect of this crisis in the faith of Islam is that human beings in general tend to get angry when they don't get their own way. And most of the greatest religions of the world, and I believe also was the intent of the Prophet Muhammad and the intent of the script of the Quran, is focused on the notion that God is not out there somewhere to be found, but God is within inside of us, and it is us that have to clear a path from inside of us to touch the Spirit of God. In other words, a true spiritual journey is not outward, it is inward. And a true spiritual journey requires us as individuals to develop compassion, to develop patience, because we're not born with patience and compassion automatically. It just doesn't come naturally for everyone. It is, I've found there's something that you need to work on every day, is being more patient and more compassionate in order for us to integrate with each other as a society of people. So when you have many people, what I would refer to in a modern day Islamic faith, who have a point of view as I'm right, and literally what the scripture here, as I interpret it, says is right, and you are all wrong, then you have a set of circumstances where we are that encourages people to exhibit some of the lowest forms of behavior in human history, some of the most deplorable forms of behavior. In other words, the behavior that says that my focus is on making the outside world and everybody in it adjust to my belief system. I must go out and tame everybody and force them to be like me. Whereas the most important component of any spiritual journey is the inward path, the path that says, I need to be more compassionate. I need to be more tolerant. Why is it that I can't be more tolerant towards someone else? Why is it that something that someone else says or does offends me so much? Why can't I acknowledge that someone else might be wrong in their thinking and allow them to think? There is another issue, is that way of thinking that forces someone to go out and change the rest of the world, I'm right and you're wrong, creates conflict. Obviously it creates conflict, and more importantly, it diminishes a person's responsibility for their own actions. In other words, it's a way of saying, I can attack you and hurt you because you're making me angry right now, because you don't believe the same way that I believe. Well, that's, in a way, that's a cop-out. It's like saying, I don't want to work on myself, so I'm going to force you to behave like me. I saw a newscast the other day where there were some modern day Islam Muslim men walking around in the United Kingdom who were approaching women who were wearing short skirts, and they were saying to them, why are you doing this? Don't you know it's not good for you? Okay, well, that's a good message. I would say that, look out for yourself. Perhaps this isn't a good way to display yourself. And we as Christians go out, and some of them, and talk to women on the streets in this way. But where they took it a step further was they insisted that the people change their clothes. In other words, what the message is that please don't dress scantily, because if you do, it may tempt me to commit some kind of a sin. You're encouraging me and my bad thinking. So in order for me to think clearly, you should not dress a certain way. Well, I think there is a level of immaturity in that way of thinking that is profound, in that what you're really saying is, look, I can't control myself. I can't control the temptations that I have. I haven't learned to develop myself and my emotional, and manage my emotional energy enough to restrain myself when I see someone who is scantily clad. I haven't learned how to change my thinking about that so that I appreciate the beauty of someone rather than their appearance as a sex object. That is, unfortunately, a very immature way of thinking. And again, it creates conflict in that a person trying to change everything on the outside in order to match up with what they believe is important, or in order to make life easy for themselves by making the world outside less tempting, is not the same thing as developing the inner strength, wisdom, fortitude, and maturity that is required to walk into a harem of naked women and still make the right decisions between right and wrong, and still do the right thing, and still restrain yourself. That is maturity. That is godliness. Forcing the outside world to be a certain way is not necessarily anything to do with godliness. But being able to be the source of compassion, being able to be the source of love, being able to be understanding of the mistakes that people make. There is a story about the Prophet Muhammad and a woman who was pregnant she had committed adultery. And in the time of his life, the story goes that the woman said that she would kill herself in order to come right with God, because it was obviously part of the practice of the Muslim faith that this woman should be killed as a result of her infidelity. But the Prophet Muhammad was reluctant to do that. He said, "No, don't do that." But she said, "Well, once I have the child, I will kill myself." And the story goes that she did have a child. She did kill herself, and the Prophet said, if everybody did that, if her blood was all over this town, if everybody did that, we would have a much different world. People would be better in some way. The concept is that she's living up to her religious ideals. But you notice in the story that even the Prophet Muhammad did not lob off her head. He had compassion. So it's clear that even when they conquered towns, they never forced people to worship their religion. They said, as long as you're a believer in God, you're with us. So that is the faith of Islam that the Prophet Muhammad taught. Everything that came after that has been a battle in the minds of people. Perhaps that dates back to the warrior tribes in the Arab areas in those days. It still persists today. The very nature of war that the Prophet Muhammad was trying to quell within people, and when he created peace, it came up again. But contrast that story to the story of Christ, who was approached by people who had found a woman who was accused of committing adultery. And Christ's answer, when the people asked, should we stone her to death, was simply, let he who has not sinned cast the first stone. Two similar situations, two different stories. But in both cases, there was compassion by, in one hand, the prophet, and on the other hand, Jesus Christ. So my deep concern, my deep wish for the faith of Islam today is that people who worship God, who call themselves Muslims, will really read the Quran, read the entire thing. Begin to really make the distinction, at least, between what is an infidel and who is an infidel and who is not. Really practice what it says in the Quran, to be accepting, at the very least, to be accepting of other people who also worship the God of the Old Testament, and Jesus Christ, who is claimed to be the Messiah in the Quran. My request is that you return to the ways of the Prophet Muhammad, in the sense that you make your spiritual journey a journey inward, to cleanse yourself, to reform yourself to be a person who is not easily manipulated by the outside world, by what they see on television, all the toxins that we see on television and the toxins that we hear on the radio. There's never been a time when we had more toxic material coming out on television than nowadays. And so my wish is that each one of us, and particularly people who are in the faith of Islam and Muslims, begin to practice developing the inner strength that is necessary, not to crush the temptations that exist, but to no longer be tempted, through a day-to-day development of their own relationship with God, and stop focusing on the outside world and trying to change that. Because, as has been said, true change, be the change that you want to see. I found that to be a very true statement. I believe it was Gandhi that said that. Be the change that you want to see. So this is my discussion for the day about the crisis of the faith of Islam, and my wish that the world become a more peaceful place. I guess the last thing I would like to add is a call to the people of Islam and the people who call themselves Muslims. Call for you to, at least, if you don't embrace the scriptures as they're written of Jesus Christ, at least embrace his one clear message of forgiveness. Being able to forgive other people enables us all to evolve. So if you consider that someone is flawed in their thinking and their beliefs about their religious faith, then please at least do as the Quran says and treat Christ as the Messiah and take his message into your own life and offer that forgiveness to other people and that compassion, no matter how difficult that may be. I know that there are people in the world, in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, who have been subjected to all sorts of atrocities and pain and suffering as a result of U.S. and European military action in those countries. But don't confuse that military action and whatever the reasons of those things were as an attack against Islam. Because I assure you, most of the people in the United States who went to that war know very little about Islam. Probably the same with many of the soldiers who came from the other nations. War is a terrible, tragic thing. And I understand loss greatly. I can't possibly imagine, I can't say that I've experienced the kind of loss that others have had where their kids may have been blown up in a building, or they've lost limbs at the same time and been incapacitated due to war, because thankfully I haven't had to go and be subject to war. But what I'm asking for from the faith of Islam and from all Muslims in order to unite with us is to practice forgiveness. You have an opportunity now to exhibit forgiveness in a way that other people will never have. I lived in South Africa for 5 years. And one thing I learned there was that when Nelson Mandela became the president of the country, many people were expecting there to be a race war between the whites and the blacks. But what prevented that was Nelson Mandela's adherence to the scriptures of Jesus Christ and the belief in saying, no, we must forgive in order to move on. An entire revolution, an entire war was averted because one man who was previously oppressed and held in prison for 25 years and beaten mercilessly, seen his friends died and treated horrifically. Nelson Mandela, if he could go through that experience and come out and realize the essence of the truth, and that if he was unable to forgive his oppressors, that more violence would continue to ensue and more difficult circumstances. If he didn't realize that, we would have a much different world today, particularly in South Africa. But we have a similar situation right now in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in the Palestinian situation in Israel. I'm aware of the history of the Palestinians, and I believe that, in my own opinion, there was a great mistake made by the country of Israel in the early days by continuing the occupation as long as they did of those territories and not giving it back to the Palestinians. That's my belief. So as a result of the occupation and not giving back the land and the freedom, they have created essentially generations of enemies against them. I'm not against Israel at all. I just think it was a mistake, just like we in the United States make many mistakes when we go to war, for different reasons. It's just one of the many sad mistakes that require Muslims and people in the Middle East to exercise forgiveness. Without that forgiveness, there will be nothing but war. There will be nothing but embattlement. You don't need a reason to forgive anybody. It's a decision that you make. And if you make that decision, peace can come from that. And then true change can come as a result of that. But without the ability, everyone has the ability to forgive. Without making the choice to do it, we are going to prolong the suffering of everybody. We're going to prolong the war. If you're a Muslim, if you believe in the faith of the Quran, if you believe in the faith of God, the God who created us, if you believe that He created us to have an experience, and that experience includes making mistakes, then we are perfect in the way that God created us, because if part of our experience includes us as human beings making mistakes, then we're having a perfect experience of life. I can't make up for the tragedy of the loss of loved ones and the damage that's done for yourself, to you and yourself. I've been damaged in my life as well, perhaps not as severely as many other people that I'm speaking to. But unless we learn, unless you learn, the ball is in your court. You can continue to wage war, you can act as terrorists, you can do all these things that will prolong suffering and pain, that will ultimately lead to nothing but death and destruction. Or you can rise above that and prove to yourselves and to the rest of the world that your faith in God is so strong that you do have the ability to forgive, that you do have the ability to reach down within inside of yourself and find the God within yourself that forgives us. That is my wish, that is my desire, that the modern day practitioners of Islam and the Muslims embrace the very simple notion of forgiveness, that they return to the scriptures that they read themselves and make a clear determination of who is an infidel. But more importantly, rather than going out and trying to manipulate the world around us, that we focus on our spiritual journey and our connection with God within ourselves every day. Because I don't know about you, but I find it a day-to-day essential practice that takes up most of my time and energy to maintain a clear relationship with God. Now, over time, it gets easier and it gets much more fulfilling and a great joy out of it. But I love God so much that I really don't have time to do something to hurt other people. I don't believe that that's what God wants us to do. And I would hope that you could get to that point as well. So thank you for listening to me today. It's my message on the crisis of identities, the identity crisis of Islam, and my prayer for all of the peace-loving, God-loving people of the world and everyone else is that we are able to live in peace and forgive each other and get along.